So yeah, there's really quite a rich range of directions that you can take within the tripos. And I think that's also part of the strength of other courses that are like that in Cambridge, like the natural sciences or like the HSBS, that it's not just that we're like bombarding you with information about stuff. Like you kind of have some agency to think, what do I want to learn from being here? And I think that's quite a Cambridge ethos actually, is that you're not just sitting here passively receiving this education, that you're actively learning to take up some agency and navigating that. But that's also where the college system comes in really helpful, because of course we've talked about supervisions, but it might not be obvious to people. So I said at the start, I'm a DOS, I'm a director of studies. And so to explain that, like I will meet all of the students in psychology at Trinity Hall at the start and end of every term, and we'll discuss things like what option papers students might be wanting to take. So, we do try and give you that agency to have some choices, but we also have like quite a lot of scaffolding and safeguards and people that you meet regularly to help you navigate that.
You could start.
Yeah, good to go.
Hey everyone, welcome to Cambridge from the Inside. We're here with a new guest today. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure thing. So I'm de-Wit. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Psychology, and I'm the director of studies for PBS here at Trinity Hall.
Nice. So today we're going to be talking about the Psychology and Behavioural Sciences course at Cambridge. So Lee, for anyone who doesn't know like what PBS is, could you give us a explanation of what the course is and why is it called Psychological Behavioural Sciences?
Yeah, sure thing. So PBS, Psychology and Behavioural Sciences, is a bit different to other psychology degrees around the country in that you have quite a lot of freedom across the 3 years to be taking papers in different departments in different schools across the university. So the psychology and behavioral sciences is our way of signaling that this is a broader degree in scope. And I think that's a bit of the ethos of some of the undergraduates at Cambridge more generally, actually. So you'll also hear about the natural sciences tripos or the HSBS tripos, and these often allow sort of much more choices across a range of topics. And PBS has a similar sort of ethos, and quite nicely reflects psychology as a discipline, because it does sort of sit somewhere in the intersection between the biological sciences and the social sciences. And so within PBS, once you're on the course, you can choose, there are a number of core psychology modules that we can get into, but there are also option papers in the more natural sciences tripos, things like neurobiology, or there are options more in the more social sciences directions like politics or sociology. So psychology and behavioral sciences offers a sort of core grounding in the experimental approach to the study of the mind and behavior, but also allows a lot of flexibility beyond that to also explore deeper into the neurosciences or deeper into the social sciences.
Nice. That's really cool. And just wanted to touch on something that you said. So before we get into PBS, can you explain a bit more about the structure of courses like the natural sciences or HSPS or PBS, and how they enable Cambridge students to make a lot of choices and choose their own course effectively?
Sure thing. So in each year of psychology, students will take 4 papers. And in our first year, 3 of those are core psychology papers. So all PBS students will be doing those. And then in second year, there are 2 core papers and 2 option papers. And then in third year, again, 4 papers. One of those has to be a research dissertation and one of those has to be in psychology. But then there are 2 option papers that could also be in psychology, or they could be in another discipline. So for that 1 option in first year, the 2 in second and the 2 in third year, students could pick papers in neighboring disciplines. So for example, quite a lot of our students in first year take a paper called mathematical biology, which is actually a paper within the natural sciences tripos, or for example, some of our students might take a first year paper in politics or social anthropology. And throughout the course, then students can sort of tailor, do they want to go more in a sort of neuroscience direction or a social science direction? So then in second year, there's a range of options that, towards the neurosciences or social sciences. Similarly, in third year, there's a range across Cambridge.
Nice. So the title of the course, Psychological and Behavioural Sciences, you explained really well why it has those two terms, psychological and behavioural. But I think especially for prospective students or students who are like in secondary school, when they think of psychology, they might think of people like Freud, for example. And I was just wondering to kind of explain to those prospective students who are watching, if they're doing PBS at Cambridge, will they be studying people like Freud?
The short answer is no, but I will give a slightly longer answer.
Okay.
I mean, Freud is obviously a really historically interesting figure in our understanding of the mind and in the sort of cultural landscape of how we think about and understand ourselves. And in a way, some of his core insights are insights that we still reflect on today, like the idea that there are things that we are not conscious of that shape the choices that we make in our lives. Like that is still bread and butter psychology. But Freud tended to think about that in very sort of motivational terms, whereas often a lot of this comes down to more sort of basic cognitive capacities, like how much attention you have to allocate to different topics. And that allocation of attention is often being driven by processes that are not necessarily conscious. So we still study things like how elements of the mind that you might call the unconscious shape our decision-making or behavior in ways that we're not aware of. But critically, we do that using the scientific method. And I think that's probably one of the most fundamental things to understand about how we approach psychology as a discipline within Cambridge, that in addition to the topics that you will learn about, learning about the scientific method, and particularly how you try and tailor the scientific method to complicated questions of behavior or measuring subjective things like attitudes, that's really a core skill that we try and train across the Psychology Behavioural Sciences tripos.
Nice. So would I be right in thinking that, I don't know, say if there are students in the humanities looking into the psychology of individuals, like an English course, the biggest difference between what they're doing and what students in PBS are doing is that if you're studying PBS, you're using the scientific methods?
Yeah, absolutely. So a health warning we should make absolutely clear: if you're going to be doing psychology, you're going to be learning stats.
Yeah.
It is a core component. If you want to understand, for example, whether the amount of screen time that people are engaging in on social media is having some kind of impact on mental health outcomes, we need to be looking at big long cross-sectional, longitudinal data sets, and we need statistical tools to tell us whether there are meaningful relationships between those variables. So many of the questions that are of interest to psychologists simply cannot be answered without a rich and sophisticated statistical toolkit. And so equipping graduates with that skill set is a core part of what the Psychology and Behavioural Sciences tripos tries to do. Nice.
And so for those who are who are trying to choose a course at the moment, who are thinking about PBS, can you tell us what the course structure is like, what you'd be learning in the first year, second year, third year?
Sure thing. So I've talked a bit about the option papers that are available, but I think it's helpful now to dive into some of the core papers. Yeah. So in first year, we have a core paper on social psychology, individual differences, and applied psychology. So social psychology looks at things like social norms, how we're influenced by the behavior of those around us. Individual differences looks at things like personality, things like the big 5 personality traits, and how those predict different aspects of behavior. Within applied psychology, we then focus on mental health, and we then focus on climate change, actually. So we have a block of lectures focused on how psychology can help us understand reactions to climate change and climate change skepticism, and how psychology might be used to help people engage in more pro-environmental behavior. Then we have a paper that is more experimental and neuroscience focused. So that is experimental psychology, from brain to cognition. And there you're learning about some of the basics of neuroanatomy, some of the basic neurotransmitters in the brain, learning about some of the tools we use to measure and understand how the brain processes information. So neuroimaging techniques like fMRI or EEG. Then we have a paper that we've called From Subjective Questions to Objective Science. And we could have called this research methods and stats, because it kind of is research methods and stats. But we try to bring students on a journey of realizing that, like, as I said, like, if you want to know, is there a relationship between how much you're using your phone and some kind of mental health outcome? Like, you might have intuitions about that. You might have like a subjective perspective on that, which is an important starting point in gathering information about how people are engaging with things, because, you know, how we engage with things is a massively subjective process, and understanding that subjectivity is really important. So one of the things on that course that we teach is qualitative methods. So how do you interrogate people's subjectivity and how they're constructing meaning in relation to what they're engaging with? But then in addition on that course, we teach people how to use more experimental methods to say, look at how people are allocating attention and how we would study how people are allocating attention. We have another lab where we look at the influence of social norms. So if we present people with a social norm that, for example, more people are engaging with some pro-environmental behavior than you might realize, does that make you more likely to engage in that behavior? And then we have a final lab where we have a world leader in our department looking at the relationship between the structure of different areas of the brain and how that predicts different behavioral outcomes. And so he walks students through that database, that neuroscience database, to ask their own questions about, is there a relationship between, say, the size of a particular area of the brain and some kind of cognitive and behavioral outcome? And how do you really ask a question like that in a sophisticated way? And so across those different labs, we're trying to engage with really interesting questions, but at the same time, trying to sort of bring out an understanding that you need a statistical toolkit to be able to address those questions. We try and embed the statistics not as a sort of dry, abstract mathematical thing, because we're not like testing your maths per se. We're testing your ability to sort of understand what kinds of statistical tools are sort of most relevant to different research questions. Then second year, we have a paper focused on developmental psychology, and then we have a paper that goes into more depth in neuroscience, and we also have an extended research project as part of that lab. So this can involve neuroimaging techniques like EEG, so we'll get students to collect patterns of neural activity using EEG, and then write that up as a lab report. And one of the reasons we're building like that, particularly that sort of experimental and empirical skill set, is that in third year, a mandatory course on the paper, and in fact, a mandatory component of all BPS accredited degrees across the UK, that's the British Psychological Society, by the way, is that you do some kind of empirical project of your own. So quite a lot of what we're doing in the first 2 years is building towards one of your 4 papers in third year, where you will do a research project in close supervision with one of the professors in our department in relation to one of their specialized areas of research. And then in third year, there's quite a large range of different options in third year. So there's more social psych, there's more neuroscience, there's more developmental, there's more on mental health. And then there's a whole range of options also in things like biological anthropology or philosophy and, outside of psychology.
Wow, nice. Yeah, it sounds like a really comprehensive course. One thing I wanted to ask about was the first year course, the first year module on like from subjective questions, subjective science. I was wondering, for the prospective students who are watching and are trying to connect how they can have an opinion about psychology but then use stats to validate that opinion. If like, whether it's in research or a student has like an idea of a theory, how do they change, like kind of how do they test that theory and then kind of use the scientific method to see if there's any truth in what they think, if you see what I mean?
Yeah, so across that paper, we have 4 in research projects that students sort of go through the full cycle of thinking, what's some of the theory in this area, what's some of the ideas we might test, what's some of the hypotheses we might develop, and then trying to sort of walk students through a sort of full research cycle of like how I would do some kind of empirical study on that question. As I said, we start with something qualitative, and it's kind of interesting because psychology is the application of the scientific method, and of course that often means trying to quantify things and trying to do experiments. But at the same time, it would be naive to think that it isn't important to understand the subjectivity by which people are constructing their understanding of the world. You can ask people's attitudes towards something, like what do you think about climate change? Yeah. And you could ask someone on a 7-point scale, like how would you support government action if they were to do, X policy? But actually qualitative methods can sometimes give you a much richer insight of how are people thinking about this problem. And so that's really part of the skill set that we try and equip students with in addition. And this is something that, as I said, is part of a training towards doing the research project in the third year. But I also think more broadly than that, I think the Psychological and Behavioural Sciences equips you with a sort of toolkit for interrogating behavior and the drivers of behavior and attitudes and the drivers of attitudes in a way that's really applicable to many different careers. So it's not just that we're sort of training you to do an obscure bit of academic research. These skills then translate into really useful applications in the real world. And we increasingly see that with our graduates, that many of them will go into the civil service, or they might go into a corporate setting where understanding human behavior is really important. One of our recent graduates went into a behavioral science team at NatWest, and they're trying to use psychology to help people not fall into bad habits and behavior with their finances. So there's a whole range of sort of challenges in corporate and government sectors that require a kind of nuanced understanding of why are people behaving in a certain way? Yeah. How are they constructing meaning around that? And I think psychology and behavioral sciences provides you with a really good skill set that you can then translate not just into research but into those more applied contexts.
Nice. I mean, this might be a bit of a tangent, but I mean, in today's world, a lot of careers and jobs are focused on evidence-led research and evidence-led policy. So would I be right in thinking that doing PBS would put you in good stead for careers like that?
Absolutely. I mean, I may be biased in my perspective on that, but to be honest, that is one of the things I'm really excited about with a course like PBS. And when I see, one of our graduates go into the civil service or something, I find that, super exciting to think, okay, we've trained you with this rigorous skill set to think critically about what's driving human behavior. And, say, for example, we then have a pandemic and we need to, think about how to provide people with the most, convincing evidence and having the right messengers that people will trust. That there are people who are trained to really think critically about these things working in government, I think is potentially really impactful.
Nice. So the next thing that we have is wondering, how are PBS students taught? Is it lectures? I mean, you're mentioning labs.
Yeah, so definitely lectures, but as you say, also lab classes, also supervisions, which we can get onto in a bit more detail. So yeah, more traditional lectures where, we're trying to explain, for example, what the structure of the brain looks like and how we might use neuroimaging techniques to interrogate that. But then also key that we have lab classes where, you learn more hands-on how to use some of these techniques and apply some of these techniques. And as I said, those lab classes are partly about building the skill set for then doing an original piece of research in your third year. I think that's a key thing to keep in mind, as not just with PBS, but any psychology degree in the UK, that you will be doing this original research project. And so part of what years 1 and 2 is trying to do is equip you with the skills and training to be doing that. So it's critical, that when you get to your third year, you've had some sort of mini practice versions of going through a sort of research cycle. So a lot of our labs are trying to take you through that process of how do you generate hypotheses? How do you think about what methods we write for teaching, for testing those hypotheses? How do you then write that up in the structured format with the expectations of what a scientific report would look like?
Nice. And you were mentioning supervisions. For anyone who doesn't know what a supervision is, can you explain what they're like and what are PBS supervisions like as well?
Absolutely. So obviously this is a key component of what education looks like at Cambridge and Oxford that is different from other universities. So in addition to your large group lectures and your lab classes, which will be quite large group activities, we'll also then break you into smaller groups, typically in your college, where with 2 or 3 or 4 other students, you'll meet an expert in that area in relation to each a paper that you're taking. And depending on the paper, you might meet them every other week or you might meet them every week. And you'll then work through some material to help you consolidate your ideas for what's being discussed in the lectures. Often this will take the form of an essay. So we'll set you an essay in relation to a substantive intellectual debate or theme within the lecture and ask you to articulate your perspective on that and then get you to discuss that in the supervision. And a lot of that is like trying to help people gain confidence in like how they use evidence to construct an argument, and being able to sort of then discuss that argument in a small group setting where you can be comfortable having your ideas discussed and reflected on. So really a key part of understanding is not just like passively learning stuff, but like actively thinking about how to apply that knowledge yourself and structure that knowledge yourself. So quite a lot of our supervisions will take that format of essays. We also have supervisions that are more oriented around statistics, where we'll have worksheets for people to follow through. And we know that a lot of people come into psychology degrees because they're passionate about understanding the mind or understanding human behavior. And, for some students, stats is a sort of necessary evil to have the skill set required to answer some of those questions. And as I say, stats is core to our teaching, but we do get that for some students, it's not necessarily the thing that they're most confident in. And so in small groups, in supervisions, we have an opportunity for students to ask questions about things they haven't understood in the lectures and work through things. And particularly, we teach students to use some simple coding environments to do their statistics. And again, like that can easily create a lot of anxiety if you're sitting in a large lecture class and like you're sitting there typing out some code and computer says no, and you can't do it. Whereas in a small group, it's a lot easier to then work through your problems. So the supervisions around stats, we think, are a really good way of helping students who struggle with that a bit more, like get over the sort of initial learning curve of that. We also in supervisions occasionally will ask students to give presentations. Okay. For example, like on a study that was discussed in the lectures, for example, getting the students to explain the research methods of that paper or the conclusions of that paper, or setting a more substantive kind of intellectual question and then asking students to respond to that question through the format of a presentation rather than an essay. And we partly do that because that's a good skill in its own right, and it's something that fits really naturally in the small group supervision system to be able to practice that skill, which is really valuable in the real world in a relatively small scale space. We also do that though because one of our papers in third year, which is an option paper, so it's not a mandatory thing to do, but one of our papers in third year has an oral exam. So rather than writing essays in the exam, you are set a question to answer and you have to present your answer to that question. Then you have to respond to questions in relation to what you present. So we use years 1 and 2 to also provide training for that oral assessment in third year, which, as I said, is an optional assessment. So it's not something students mandatorily have to take. But actually, a lot of students do find that a really rewarding assessment to take and find it a sort of context to build that skill in presenting your ideas in a more safe and comfortable environment than maybe the first time you have to do that in a job interview or something.
So would you say the supervisions really help with that oral exam, like in terms of preparing for it, and if students would go on to do things like job interviews, the supervision system really build your confidence for situations like that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in a way, even if you've written an essay for your supervision, your supervisor might then ask you some questions like, why did you make that argument? Or like, why did you think that study was good evidence for that claim? So developing those kind of skills and articulating your ideas, I think is actually always something that has been a strength of the Oxbridge system. And I think is probably part of why Oxbridge graduates tend to do really well when they graduate. But yeah, we made a decision a couple of years ago to sort of acknowledge, like, actually, this is such a great skill that a lot of our students get to develop. Like, let's actually have it as part of our assessments, because particularly for students who maybe like don't flourish so much with writing essays, it also gives them an opportunity to flourish with a different format. I would say also, in a way, though, the supervisions in the first and second year, they also just help you give you a sort of flavor for how do you find it presenting? Is it something you want to do as an assessment in your third year? And then if you take that option paper in your third year, all of the supervisions on that paper are tailored toward developing that presentation skills. So I'd say the first and second year are more about sort of finding your feet and like if it's something you'd want to do. And then if you do take the paper, the supervisions are sort of tailored to provide more training for that on that paper.
Nice. And I imagine one of the benefits of the supervision is that say if you're in a big class and you have like a very specific question, you might not be able to ask the professor that your like specific question, but in a supervision, you always have an expert in the field to ask those questions.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is something we talk about in our first year social psychology lectures, actually, because we're lucky enough at the moment that the Vice Chancellor, Deborah Prentice, guest lectures on one of our first year papers.
Oh, nice.
And she's an expert in this idea of pluralistic ignorance, which is this idea that you're not always very good at assessing what other people are thinking in a given situation. So, you might be anxious about something that you think you don't understand, and you look around, and obviously you can feel your anxiety very viscerally, but you look around the room and everyone else is just kind of, making the notes or, kind of looks fine. And so you think, oh, well, it must be only me who doesn't get this. Yeah. So it's very easy in group situations, particularly with, larger groups, to misattribute where people are at. And indeed, like it's interesting because, of course, the supervision system has existed for a long time before that, like social psychology understanding of like this pluralistic ignorance was developed. But I think the supervision system responded, is a really sort of clever social technology in a way to make education a more rewarding experience because it gets easier to express things that you don't understand in that smaller group format.
Nice, because it's I guess that phenomenon of the first person asking a question that they think is like a dumb question that turns out everyone in the room had that same question.
Yeah, absolutely.
Nice. And it's cool. This sounds like a really interesting topic that you can learn about in PBS as well. So the last thing that we have here is wanting to know about more about your research interests and what you've done so far and what you're doing now.
Sure, yeah. So I actually started my career more on the neuroscience end of psychology, trying to understand if a patient has a particular type of brain damage, for example, what might that mean about what kinds of visual stimuli they can still recognize or not. But I had quite a big career change about 10 years ago where I really appreciated developing that scientific skill set in really rigorously interrogating questions of human psychology and how the brain works. But I realized personally, I wanted to apply that to something that was for me more meaningful. And so I actually pivoted to the study of political psychology, which is the science of why do people make certain decisions? Like, what is it about you that makes you prefer one political party versus another? So a lot of that work, for example, looks at the moral values that we hold. And again, it sort of goes back to this point we were discussing about Freud, that we don't always know what's driving our behavior. So, we can show in survey-based research that there are certain moral values that are highly likely to predict how people will vote. People aren't necessarily aware that those things might be driving their behavior. So it's one of the things I research, and obviously it's impossible to kind of research political psychology at the moment without being really interested in what a lot of political psychologists refer to as polarization. It's a sense that somehow politics is becoming more acrimonious and more hostile, and it's sort of harder to reach consensus. So we've done a number of studies in this space. For example, showing that, stereotyping, which we do in many features of our life, we kind of caricatures of what other people are like, that we seem to do that in politics as well. So we develop a kind of caricature of what the average Remain voter is like or what the average Leave voter is like. And often there's some accuracy to those caricatures. If I was to ask you, who goes to Greg's or who goes to Pret, you might have an intuition about that might on average be more likely to be true. But we see that those perceptions are exaggerated. So, on a whole range of issues, we often find that people think the other side is more extreme than they appreciate. One of the other areas we've done a lot of work on is trying to unpick a little bit more the kind of cognitive science of what it means to be groupish about how we engage with politics, because we know that from a lot of psychology that the groups we belong to are sort of an important part of our own sense of self-esteem. So we can find it rewarding when our group does well because that sort of reflects on our own status. Yeah. A lot of people translate that idea into politics and think, well, my group identity as a Democrat or a Republican in the US, for example, is sort of part of my identity. And so I kind of have these like kind of cognitive blinkers to think, okay, my party said this. I better believe that's true because it would sort of look bad on me if I was supporting the party that wasn't articulating correct beliefs about stuff. And that's quite a plausible and interesting theory as to how our psychology is engaging with the modern political system. But at the same time, it's also kind of complicated as to why that would be a driver. And indeed, the US is sort of an odd context in that more people will be likely to identify with the Democrats and Republicans than you'll see people will want to identify with a political party in the UK. And actually, in the UK particularly the last couple of years, people have switched from being supporters of Labour to supporters of Reform or supporters of the Green. So actually people have quite fragile senses of their political identity to an extent. But at the same time, we still see a lot of this kind of groupish behaviour. So part of a big part of our research is trying to understand what is it that shapes why we end up being quite groupish, but in a way that's not necessarily just based on having an identity. So one of the things we've looked at and we've worked on quite recently, we've got some grant funding to look at the moment, is this really cognitive science idea of like information dependencies. So like if I have a claim from 10 different people, I'd be likely to update my beliefs in line with that claim. Yeah. But if I learn that all of those 10 people are all making that claim because they've all read it from the same newspaper, it would actually be quite rational for me to sort of downweight how much I should update my beliefs in relation to that claim. So that's actually quite a rational thing to do, is to think about the dependencies between sources when updating your beliefs. And we've shown that seems to play out in politics. Like if you're more extreme towards the left, you tend to think the right are really dependent in their thinking. They all come from the same backgrounds, they're all reading the same newspapers. And similarly, if you're on the right, you tend to think the left is sort of more dependent in their thinking. And so this shows how like a slightly more nuanced cognitive mechanism might account for some of the sort of groupishness we see in human behavior. I think I'd also say like this research program for me, I think partly reflects what I'm really excited about with the Psychology and Behavioural Sciences tripos more generally, that, we're trying to get students to learn simultaneously about, how psychology might be applied to real world challenges like climate change, at the same time as to, trying to get people to think about, how is the brain processing really fundamental things like threat or anxiety or uncertainty. And actually, I think a lot of the future of psychology will be sort of trying to translate across those levels of analysis, particularly say something like mental health. Like we know that there are, neural underpinnings to changes in mental health, but at the same time, it's sort of manifesting in complex social environments with sort of changes in information ecosystems like uses of social media. And for me, that's part of the strength of Psychological and Behavioural Sciences tripos, that I think we're trying to sort of equip people with skills to think across those different levels of analysis.
Nice. Wow, it's really interesting. And I can imagine, I imagine a fair few psychology courses across the country might be specific to psychology, whereas if you're like yourself, a student who really interested in political psychology, am I right in thinking you can both do psychology and politics and maybe marry the two in the PBS tripos?
Yeah, so there's a first year paper in politics that students can borrow in their first year. And there are some philosophy papers also that get into some of the philosophy of politics. So indeed, like if that were a direction one were interested in going in, you could tailor a bit of the course towards a specialism in that. But I'd say that's like one of many examples of potential pathways you could take within PBS.
Because there's a sociology paper as well. So if they're interested in group thinking, I imagine they can do that.
Yeah.
As well as the variety of papers in the natural sciences as well that they can borrow from.
Yeah, absolutely. And also we borrow quite a few papers from biological anthropology as well. So, if you want to sort of think, how does primate behavior relate to why we behave the way we do as humans, there's an option to dive into that. So there's really quite a rich range of directions that you can take within the tripos. And I think that's also part of the strength of other courses that are like that in Cambridge, like the natural sciences or like the HSBS, that it's not just that we're like bombarding you with information about stuff. Like you kind of have some agency to think, what do I want to learn from being here? And I think that's quite a Cambridge ethos, actually, is that you're not just sitting here passively receiving this education, that you're actively learning to take up some agency and navigating that. But that's also where the college system comes in really helpful, because of course we've talked about supervisions, but might not be obvious to people. So I said at the start, I'm a DOS, I'm a director of studies. And so to explain that, like I will meet all of the students in psychology at Trinity Hall at the start and end of every term, and we'll discuss things like what option papers students might be wanting to take. So, we do try and give you that agency to have some choices, but we also have like quite a lot of scaffolding and safeguards and people that you meet regularly to help you navigate that.
Nice. Yeah, I think it's interesting how in Cambridge, if you say the phrase borrowing papers, everyone understands, knows what you mean, but because it's such a normal idea of that, even if you're doing a course with a certain name, you're very likely to be able to borrow papers from another course, which is really cool, and more students should know about that when they're considering Cambridge and other universities, because it's a really cool thing that you can do in Cambridge. And lastly, just for like any advice for students who are watching, they're wanting to study psychology, and they're trying to decide between different universities, like what advice would you have for them for them to try to choose which university, which course that they would like to study?
Yeah, actually, maybe think of one thing I wanted to follow up on with your point about the kind of quirky vernacular of Cambridge, because it's a really interesting thing about the social anthropology of Cambridge, I think, like you come here and like suddenly, you don't refer to it as St. Catherine's College, you call it St. Cat's, and for most of the colleges, they will have their own nicknames. And very quickly, like students will learn that vernacular. And it can very easily seem like there's a sort of in-group to Cambridge that like understands it and gets it and is like meant to belong here. And maybe I'm not meant to belong here. And I think I would really encourage students not to think like that. Like if you're excited about ideas, if you're excited about the subject that you're looking at, like absolutely think about coming to study here. As I said earlier, like a lot of social psychology tells us that we can have stereotypes about what a certain place is like. I think lots of people do have stereotypes about what Cambridge is like that just aren't accurate today. And yeah, definitely do not just assume that Cambridge is not for you because of some like media conception of what the place is like.
Nice, really cool. Really good podcast. Unless there's anything else you wanted to add?
I guess one little detail in addition to that, I know something that we get a lot of questions about from students is like, what kind of experience might help, give them an advantage in an application to study psychology at Cambridge. And I think really important for us to say here that like, I think we're really careful in how we assess undergraduate applications in trying to avoid anything that just reflects a kind of historic advantage in differences between people's upbringing. So, depending on like where you're born and your family or whatever, like you might have access to certain like cultural or intellectual resources that not everyone has access to. Like maybe you could ask a friend of your parents or something for an internship in their lab or something. And so like that kind of opportunity is not available to everybody. So we do not look for things like that. It's not part of our application process. I would say, if you're when you're thinking about writing your personal statement, like, we want to understand why you're interested in psychology, but, maybe you've got a Saturday job at Tesco and you're interested, you kind of find it interesting, like, why do they put some things at some levels on the shelf at eye level, other things close to the till? Like, how does that choice architecture, as we refer to it in psychology, how does that shape the kind of decision making that people might make? Like, if you can help bring to life for us something in your experience that helps us understand like why you want to apply the scientific method to study the mind or behavior, like, tell us about that. We don't like really care about its like cultural status. Like, we care that you are interested in intellectually engaging in this discipline.
Nice. Choice architecture is it gives a headache, the term. It sounds really cool.
It's one of my favorite psychology terms, choice architecture.
Choice architecture. What does it mean?
So it's the sort of idea that no choice architecture is neutral. So, so go back to the supermarket example. Like, you have to make some decision about, if you're going to have sweets and vegetables, where are you going to put them?
Yeah.
There's no absolute neutral ground truth of where those things should be. And so where you put them is going to influence the type of decision that people might make, again, in ways that people might not necessarily be aware of. So there's this idea that actually, if we can be more deliberative in how we structure choice architectures, we can potentially help people make the decisions that they would want to make themselves if we sort of make the choice architecture easier for them. So like a classic example of this within the UK government is that a couple of years ago, people recognized that not enough people were saving towards their pensions. Yeah. People wanted to save more for their pensions. They recognized that this is something they should be doing, but the behavior just wasn't manifesting. And so government switched the default so that when you start a new job, you're auto-enrolled into a pension. And you can sign some forms and extract yourself from that. But when I started my job here, I really disliked filling out forms, so I defaulted into the pension, and now I have a pension pot building up. And so that subtle change in the choice architecture can, in some cases, have quite a big impact.
Nice. And I imagine am I right to assume when people are talking about the term choice architecture, they're ignoring the potential question of talking about whether they themselves are a product of choice architecture, if you see what I mean? Because I guess because it kind of presumes that you can create an architecture that affects someone else's choices, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think this is a really interesting question, and there's a sort of new. So the concept of choice architecture was articulated in this book, Nudge. So this idea that you can sort of tweak a choice architecture to nudge people towards a certain decision.
Yeah.
There's a fear that that's like quite a paternalistic way of approaching things, that you sort of have a nanny state, like deciding for you how to do things. Yeah. And so there's an increasing movement towards the idea that it's not just that we as government or as psychologists, we should be advising government on how to nudge people, but that we should also help people understand how their choice architecture is influencing them. Yeah. So like if you have an intention to go to the gym more regularly, then we know that if that gym is close to you, you're much more likely to go. So actually, if you can like structure your choice and architecture in a way that makes that choice easier for you. And again, these things, it might sound trivial, but like in a way, like one of the kind of core lessons of the study of human decision-making and behavior is that if you can make a decision easy, that's one of the best things you can do. Like, so we often, when we think about like, oh, we've got to get more people to recycle or more people to like consume more environmentally friendly products or just reduce consumption, that actually one of the best things we can do is just make that easy for people.
Nice.
We often think we've got to change people's motivations, but actually often like changing whether it's just easy to do can be more effective than trying to target something, more complicated and maybe tied to someone's identity, like their motivations.
Nice. So there's a shift from trying to affect what other people's choices are to using it to be more self-aware.
Yeah. So there's literally a concept of like nudge plus that is sort of like getting people to deliberate on their choices in a way that would give them more agency to think, actually, I want to avoid doing that in the future. So actually, I'm going to like structure my choice architecture, my environment in a way that like makes it easier for me to do that in the future. Nice.
Wow, that sounds really interesting. We've got to stop there, but I think we could keep talking forever. And I imagine a lot of people watching, if you find those conversations interesting, will enjoy doing a PBS course. So thank you, Lee, for joining us. Real pleasure. I'm sure lots of people find this useful. And thanks to the viewers for watching, whether it's on a podcasting platform or on YouTube. We're going to be doing more podcasts covering the remaining courses that we haven't done. So we'll see you guys next time.
That's great. Thank you very much. And thanks for the beautiful cup as well. It's a lovely college logo on there.
Yeah. They're nice cups.
Great. Nice. Thank you.
No worries. Oh, that was good. I think it was really good.